could believe, looking at life in France in 1914, that the country, along with the whole of Europe, was about to be struck by one of the most terrible tragedies in history. It is true that Alsace-Lorraine was still an unhealed wound, and that there was bitter hatred of the Germans, still known by the insulting name of Les Boches. But nobody really thought that war was possible. There had been peace for nearly 45 years. It was the time of the Franco-Russian alliance, and the Entente Cordiale had replaced the old rivalry with Britain. But the danger was there. Europe's peace was an armed one. The Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted a place in the sun. The Parisian crowd filled the Avenue du Bois. Paris danced in the beautiful summer of 1914. And then a spark set everything aflame.
The war at the beginning of 1917 looked very similar to the war of 1915, with trench systems dividing Europe into two armed camps. In France, the trenches stretched 400 miles from the Swiss border all the way to Newport on the Belgian coast. The depth of this ribbon of death and destruction was around 10,000 yards, defined by the maximum range of artillery. Villages had completely disappeared, and the major towns such as Albert, Arras and Rheims badly damaged. But beyond the range of the heavy artillery, life went on more or less as normal, at least on the Allies' side of the line. Away from the front line, soldiers could rest and recuperate. Equipment could be stored and repaired in huge service yards. On the German side, life was hard. The Royal Navy's blockade was beginning to bite, leading to shortages. Austere economic measures were introduced that saw France and Belgium plundered for food and labor. On the 1st of February, Germans resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. As a result, the US severed diplomatic links with Germany. The sinking, without warning, of unarmed ships was too much for the American public and would become a significant factor in bringing the United States into the war later in the year. Germany was prepared to brazen it out, believing that her submarines would prevent American troops from crossing the Atlantic should the United States come into the war on the Allies' side. But 1917, the fourth year of the war, was to see more carnage and destruction. For some, it had become too much to bear, and mutiny was in the air. The French army was all but paralyzed by mutinies. But the most catastrophic mutiny of all occurred in the Russian army. After 3 years of fighting, Russia had suffered enormous losses on the battlefield and was now faced with food and fuel shortages. There were strikes and riots breaking out in cities all over Russia. Dissatisfied with the army's conduct of the war, Nicholas had taken personal command in September 1915. But continuing military disasters reflected badly on the new supreme commander rather than the army command. Consequently, Nicholas's popularity dwindled. By late 1916, royalists within the Duma, the Russian parliament, warned the Tsar that revolution was imminent. Even so, Nicholas refused to sanction further constitutional reform. During the so-called February Revolution in 1917, which he misinterpreted as a minor uprising, his routine suppression orders to the Petrograd garrison sparked its mutiny on the 10th of March. Nicholas II was persuaded to abdicate on the 15th of March 1917, following the recommendation of the Russian Army High Command. In search of exile elsewhere, Lloyd George offered a haven in Britain, only for the offer to be withdrawn under the direction of King George V, who did not wish to be associated with his autocratic cousin. Moved to the Siberian city of Ekaterinburg by the Bolsheviks, Nicholas and his family were executed on the night of the 16th-17th of July 1918. But the new government under Alexander Kerensky fared little better. A large offensive was launched against the German army, but it quickly turned to a failure. At this point, the entire Russian army began to fall apart and walk away. Entire army groups left the trenches, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers deserted. The Germans, exploiting the problems unfolding in Russia, mounted a fresh offensive in the north. They succeeded in capturing Riga, which was the most important of the Baltic ports. The collapse of Kerensky's leadership created a vacuum, which the Bolsheviks, now led by Lenin, were ready to fill. A second revolution in October brought the Bolsheviks to power. For the Russians, the Great War was essentially over, but a cruel and vicious civil war was about to begin. The collapse of the Russian army allowed Germany to begin moving its best troops to the Western Front to face England and France. Planning also began for a large offensive in France for the next year, 1918. With relations with the United States at breaking point, the Germans were all too aware that if they were to defeat the Allies, then it would have to be before American forces arrived in France. The final push that drove the United States to war was a telegram. The German Foreign Minister, Arthur Zimmermann, sent a telegram to a German agent in Mexico. The Zimmermann telegram suggested that if Mexico were to join Germany in an alliance and attack the United States, they would get Texas and Arizona in return. British intelligence gave the intercepted message to the Americans, and it was duly published in all major newspapers. It was the final straw, and American President Woodrow Wilson had no choice but to declare war on Germany on April 6, 1917. On the 28th of May, the first units of the American Expeditionary Force left New York, bound for France. Their commander was General John Black Jack Pershing. Unfortunately for the Allies, the Americans only had a small and poorly equipped army of just over 100,000 men. Its best units were the Marine Corps. It was to take over a year before the American forces were able to get to Europe, train and be ready to fight. Pershing was determined to keep his forces under American control and not see them used as reinforcements to make up British and French losses. The most important thing about America's involvement was that some 4 million troops were to be raised. In addition, the powerful economy and industry of the United States was now part of the Allied war effort. But it was by no means certain that the Allies could hold out. In February, the Germans had begun to withdraw to a new defense system called the Hindenburg Line. The Hindenburg Line was a vast system of defenses in northern France, constructed by the Germans during the winter of 1916-17. It ran from the area around Arras all the way to beyond Saint-Quentin and consisted of deep and wide trenches, thick belts of barbed wire, concrete machine gun positions, concrete bunkers, tunnels and command posts. It was considered virtually impregnable by the Germans, although the British offensives of 1917-1918 were to prove otherwise. As the Germans withdrew, they laid waste to towns, villages and countryside, so that all the Allies would inherit was a wasteland. It was a cruel policy that tore families apart, as able-bodied men and women were deported to Germany as slave workers. Robert Nivelle succeeded Joffre as Commander-in-Chief of the French Army in December 1916. He believed in aggressive tactics and introduced the innovative use of a creeping barrage of artillery fire. The idea was that artillery would aim its fire to land just in front of the infantry as they advanced. It was a technique that required practice and good lines of communication. Unfortunately, it was usually the telephone lines that usually got cut first in any enemy attack, and so there were incidents of artillery fire falling on their own troops. The main battle of the Nivelle offensive was fought on the Aisne from the 16th of April. It was an unmitigated disaster for the French army, a hugely costly attack, ultimately involving 1.2 million troops and 7,000 guns. It achieved little in the way of territorial gain, certainly not to the 48-hour breakthrough envisaged. Divisions of the French 5th and 6th armies went into battle along an 80-kilometer front from Soissons to Rheims, after a week of diversionary attacks by the British in Arras. Opposite, the Germans occupied high ground that was heavily defended and fortified. On the 16th of April, the French suffered 40,000 casualties alone, a similar disaster to that suffered by the British on the first day of the Somme a year before. The mass use of French-built light tanks brought little advantage, with 150 lost on the first day. Ironically, in the attacks of the 16th and 17th of April, Nivelle's own innovation, the creeping barrage, was incorrectly deployed, leading to increased French casualties as the infantry advanced without protection. Despite suffering huge losses, French attacks continued until the 20th of April. Some gains were made, but progress was slow. The offensive was scaled back over the next 2 weeks, although by the 5th of May, a 4-kilometer stretch of the Chemin des Dames ridge, part of the Hindenburg line, had been captured. The offensive was finally abandoned in disarray on the 9th of May following a final ineffective 4-day assault. French losses were significant, with 187,000 casualties. The Germans suffered an estimated 168,000 losses. But the French soldiers had had enough. Discontent had spread throughout the army, and some 30,000 men decided to leave their trenches and walk home. Many men had not been home in the 3 years since the war had begun. Officers were allowed to go home on a regular basis, but lowly privates were not given these privileges. Even British soldiers got home more often than French troops, even though they were fighting in their own country. In addition to the men who left the trenches, some 54 divisions, about half of the French army, refused to obey orders from their commanding generals. Discipline in the army collapsed and panic spread in the French high command and government. If the army quit fighting, then the war would be lost, and all the sacrifices made would be for nothing. Reaction was quick on the part of the high command. Several older generals were quickly replaced, and a new overall commander was selected. General Pétain, who had fought several successful battles, was chosen to lead the army. He immediately took charge of the situation. Mass arrests were made of all the leaders of the mutiny. Officers and NCOs had to select men from their own units for trial. 24,000 men were tried and found guilty. 400 were sentenced to death, but only 50 were shot. The rest had their sentences commuted. Pétain also implemented a number of improvements for the men in the army. Better food, home leaves and periods of rest were put into effect. After 6 weeks of mutiny, the French army had been restored. Yet a powerful change had come over the army. It became clear that the French army would fight to defend their country, but would not go over to attack. This meant that the British and Commonwealth troops would now do the bulk of the fighting on the Western Front. The fighting spirit of the British and Commonwealth soldiers was to be severely tested during 1917. At Vimy Ridge, the Canadians showed that they had overcome their terrible experience at Ypres the year before by taking this important objective. Some 12 kilometers northeast of Arras, Vimy Ridge gained early importance during the war on account of the heights which overlooked the Allied-held town. German forces seized control of the ridge in September 1914 and promptly constructed deep defensive positions comprising of bunkers, caves, passages and artillery-proof trenches, heavily protected by concrete machine gun emplacements. With such formidable defenses in place, the German army rapidly set about the steady destruction of Arras, pounding the town with heavy artillery, apparently with impunity. French attempts to grab control of the bridge throughout 1915 were bloodily repulsed, with the loss of some 150,000 French casualties. Although the British relieved French operations in March 1916, they were pushed back along a 2-kilometre front before they could commence planning their recapture. As part of this offensive, the Canadian Corps, operating under British General Julian Byng, were tasked with the recapture of Vimy Ridge. In preparation for this, the Canadians constructed miles of tunnels through which troops could pass in readiness for the opening of the attack without coming under shell fire. Aerial reconnaissance, using observation balloons, ensured accurate news of German movements. At dawn on the morning of the 9th of April, Easter Monday 1917, the Canadian attack comprising 4 divisions began, following a heavy 3-week British artillery barrage and was supported by a well-devised creeping barrage. Within 30 minutes, the Canadian 1st Division under Arthur Currie had succeeded in capturing German frontline positions in spite of a snowstorm. Within a further half an hour, the second line had similarly passed into Canadian hands. With the entire ridge wholly under Allied control, by the 12th of April, the operation was judged a spectacular success, the single most successful Allied advance on the Western Front to that date. The ridge remained in Allied hands for the remainder of the war. But it did not come without cost. 10,602 Canadians were wounded during the attack, and over 3,500 killed. The opposing German force suffered even more heavily, with 20,000 casualties. The Allies' successes continued further north. The Battle of Messines was the most successful local operation of the war, certainly of the Western Front. Carried out by General Herbert Plummer's Second Army, it was launched on the 7th of June 1917 with the detonation of 19 underground mines underneath German lines. The target of the offensive was the Messines Ridge, a natural stronghold southeast of Vimy, and a small German salient since late 1914. The attack was also a precursor to the much larger Third Battle of Ypres, often known as Passchendaele. General Plummer had begun plans to take the Messines Ridge in early 1916. Plummer preferred to plan for limited successes rather than gamble all on significant breakthrough. In preparing for the Messines battle, he had authorized the laying of 22 mine shafts underneath German lines all along the ridge. He planned to detonate all 22 at 0 hour at 3:10 on the 7th of June. Whilst the Germans were still dazed, the explosions were to be followed by infantry attacks, supported by artillery bombardments, tanks and gas. Work on laying the mines began some 18 months before. In the face of active German counter-mining, 8,000 meters of tunnel were constructed under German lines. Occasionally the tunnelers would encounter German counterparts engaged in the same task. Underground hand-to-hand fighting would ensue. Heavy preliminary artillery bombardment of the German lines began on the 21st of May. 2,300 guns and 300 heavy mortars were available for the opening barrage. At 2:50 on the morning of the 7th of June, the firing stopped. The German troops, sensing imminent attack, rushed to their defensive positions, machine guns ready, meanwhile sending up flares to detect British movement towards the ridge. Silence prevailed for the following 20 minutes until, at 3:10, the order was given across the line to detonate the mines, which totaled 600 tons of explosive. Of the 21 mines laid, 19 were exploded. The invariable loss of surprise by the use of preliminary bombardment was entirely offset by the effect of the mines, which blew the crest off the Messines ridge. The explosion was audible in Dublin and by Lloyd George in his Downing Street study. The effect of the mine explosions upon the German defenders was devastating. Some 10,000 men were killed during the explosion alone. In its wake, 9 divisions of infantry advanced under protection of a creeping artillery barrage, tanks and gas attacks. All initial objectives were taken within 3 hours. Reserves from General Gough's Fifth Army and the French First Army reached their own final objectives by mid-afternoon. German troops counterattacked on the 8th of June without success. In fact, they lost further ground as the attacks were repelled. German counterattacks continued in diminishing form until the 14th of June. By this stage, the entire Messines salient was in Allied hands. The Messines battle, which greatly boosted morale among the Allies, signified the first time on the Western Front that defensive casualties actually exceeded attacking losses, 25,000 against 17,000. Whereas the first and second battles of Ypres were launched by the Germans in 1914 and 1915 respectively, Third Ypres was intended as Sir Douglas Haig's Allied forces' breakthrough in Flanders in 1917. Haig had long mulled the idea of launching a major offensive in Flanders. It was his preferred choice for 1916, although in the event the Battle of the Somme took precedence that summer. Meticulously planned, Third Ypres was launched on the 31st July 1917 and continued until the fall of Passchendaele village on the 6th of November. The offensive resulted in gains for the Allies, but was by no means the breakthrough Haig intended, and such gains as were made came at great cost in human terms. Today commonly referred to simply as Passchendaele, the tactics employed at the Third Battle of Ypres are as controversial as those executed at the Battle of the Somme a little over a year earlier, and was the final great battle of attrition of the war. The ostensible aim of the campaign was to be the destruction of German submarine bases on the Belgian coast. British Admiral Lord Jellicoe had issued a warning that the current level of shipping losses would prevent the British from sustaining the war into 1918, thus requiring clearance of the bases on the Belgian coast. Haig, whilst recognizing the urgency of this requirement, was at least as interested in finally breaking the will of the German army, which he believed was near to collapse, a view that he had similarly held at the height of the Somme offensive a year earlier. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George was opposed to the Passchendaele offensive, and later came out highly critical of Haig's strategy and tactics in his published memoirs. But in the absence of a credible alternative, he felt obliged to sanction Haig's plans. He was, however, encouraged by the greatest local success of the war earlier that summer, the capture of the Messines Ridge under General Plummer. The capture of the ridge was a necessary precursor to an offensive aimed at capturing Passchendaele Ridge. With the instability of Russian forces in the field and the possibility of a Russian withdrawal from the war, the Allies were acutely aware such an action would enable Germany to draft its eastern forces into battle on the Western Front, dramatically increasing their reserve strength. The Third Battle of Ypres was opened by Sir Hubert Gough's Fifth Army, with one corps of Sir Herbert Plummer's Second Army joining on its right, and a corps of the French First Army, a total of 12 divisions. On the 18th of July, as was the norm for any major Allied offensive, a heavy preliminary artillery bombardment lasted for the 10 days. This was followed by the infantry attack at 0350 on the 31st of July. 3,000 guns which fired 4.25 million shells. Given such an onslaught, the German Fourth Army fully expected an imminent offensive. The element of surprise was entirely lost. Thus, when the attack was launched across an 18-kilometre front, the Fourth Army was in place to hold off the main British advance around the Messines Road. This restricted the Allies to fairly small gains to the left of the line around Pilkem Ridge. Similarly, the French were halted further north by the German Fifth Army. British attempts to renew the offensive over the course of the next few days were severely hampered by the onset of heavy rains, the heaviest in 30 years, which churned the Flanders lowland soil into a thick, muddy swamp. Tanks found themselves immobile, stuck fast in the mud. Similarly, the infantry found their mobility severely limited. Ironically, the very force of the preliminary bombardment had itself destroyed drainage systems, exacerbating the problem. In addition, the artillery shells that had rained down in the days prior to the attack's launch had further churned up the very ground that needed to be traversed by the advancing Allied force. As a consequence, no renewed major offensive could be contemplated until the 16th of August, when the Battle of Langemarck saw 4 days of fierce fighting, which resulted in small gains for the British, but with heavy casualties. Dissatisfied with progress, the British Commander-in-Chief, Haig, replaced Sir Hubert Gough by moving him and his forces further north with Herbert Plummer. Whereas Gough favoured sweeping aggression, Plummer planned a series of small gains rather than seeking an all-out breakthrough. The attacks began afresh on the 20th of September with the Battle of the Messines Road Bridge. This was followed by the Battle of Polygon Wood on the 26th of September and the Battle of Bruenstein on the 4th of October. Taken together, these established British possession of the ridge east of Ypres. Encouraged by Plumer's small gains, while constantly pushing him to do more, Haig decided to continue the offensive towards Passchendaele Ridge, some 10 kilometers from Ypres, by now certain that the German army was approaching collapse. Little progress towards this end was made at the Battle of Polycapelle and the First Battle of Passchendaele on the 9th of October and 12th of October, respectively. The Allied attackers were themselves nearing exhaustion as German reserves released from the Eastern Front were pouring onto the ridge. To aid their defense, the Germans made use of mustard gas, which caused chemical burns. Unwilling to concede the failure of the breakthrough, Haig pressed on with a further 3 assaults on the ridge in late October. The eventual capture of Passchendaele village by British and Canadian forces on the 6th of November finally gave Haig an excuse to call off the offensive, claiming success. The Third Battle of Ypres was, like its predecessors, a costly exercise. The British Expeditionary Force incurred some 310,000 casualties, with a similar, lower number of German casualties, 260,000. The salient had been widened by several kilometers. Further south in France, the Allies were to experience a major success with a new type of warfare using tanks. The Battle of Cambrai, launched in November 1917, heralded the first time tanks were used in significant force, a little over a year after they had made their tentative debut at Flers on the Somme. By the autumn of 1917, the popular reputation of tank effectiveness had suffered. Aside from their undoubted value as a surprise weapon, they were deemed to be of limited use as they were unwieldy and prone to breakdowns. Indeed, the German High Command, having overcome their initial alarm at the sudden appearance of the huge mechanical beasts, came to regard the tank with disdain, a device readily destroyed by use of concentrated field artillery. Given such an attitude, it was hardly surprising that German tank development came relatively late in the war. Nevertheless, the British Tank Corps remained convinced that if used on firmer ground, the weapon would prove itself. Thus, Lieutenant Colonel John Fuller of the Tank Corps recommended wide-scale use of tanks upon the dry battlefields sited between the Canal du Nord and the Saint-Quentin Canal. Fuller's proposal was promptly taken up by the Third Army commander, Julian Byng, the commander on the ground, but was vetoed by the British Commander-in-Chief, Sir Douglas Haig, who preferred to continue with operations at Passchendaele. In time, however, Haig, disappointed at the lack of progress at Passchendaele, turned back to Fuller and Byng's scheme, attracted by the notion of achieving a useful victory using the new weapon before the year was out. The attack was launched at dawn on the morning of the 20th of November, with all available tanks advancing across a 10-kilometer front. 476 tanks were accompanied by 6 infantry and 2 cavalry divisions, who were to exploit any breakthrough, plus a further 1,000 guns. 14 newly formed squadrons of the Royal Flying Corps stood by, a forerunner of the blitzkrieg tactics employed to great effect by the German army during the Second World War. And usually there was no preliminary bombardment, which helped ensure that the attack was a complete surprise. Within hours, the lightly defended Germans were forced back some 6 kilometers to Cambrai, the 3 trench systems of the Hindenburg line pierced for the first time in the war. Approximately 8,000 prisoners and 100 guns were captured on the first day alone. Much encouraged and greatly surprised by the notable gains of the first day, Haig determined to press on with the attack. But once the initial surprise had passed, British gains proved much harder to come by. Unfortunately, a lack of support to follow up the surprise breakthrough of the first day resulted in a critical loss of momentum. Despite their initial surprise, the Germans began pressing home wave after wave of counterattacks. Some 20 divisions were deployed during the German counterattack. Within a week, virtually all ground lost had been reclaimed. During the battle, casualties were high. The Germans suffered losses of approximately 50,000 and the British 45,000. If ultimately the mass deployment of tanks had failed to achieve the desired breakthrough, it had nevertheless demonstrated the tank's potential in offensive operations. In Britain, news of the initial spectacular breakthrough was greeted with celebrations and the ringing of church bells for the first time during the war. However, the war was not going well on the Italian front. The stalemate along the Isonzo River that had survived 11 battles was about to be broken. The Battle of Caporetto, which is also referred to as the 12th Battle of the Isonzo, saw combined Austro-Hungarian and German forces decisively break through the Italian line along the northern Isonzo. The Italian defenders were caught entirely by surprise. The scale of the Italian defeat at Caporetto led to both a change in government and Luigi Cardonia's dismissal as Chief of Staff. Caporetto marked the first occasion on which the Germans provided assistance to their Austro-Hungarian allies on the Italian front. Although Cardonia's policy of launching successive breakthrough attacks along the Isonzo was proving highly costly in terms of Italian casualties, it was nevertheless succeeding in dangerously weakening Austro-Hungarian resources. Nine Austrian divisions were supplemented by 6 German divisions. Although the Italians retained over numerical supremacy along the Isonzo front by some 41 divisions to 35, they were notably weaker at the point selected by the German army for a combined offensive. Launched at 2 a.m. on the 24th of October from a salient at Tolmino, and much aided by prevalent misty conditions, the Austro-Hungarian-German attack took the Italians by complete surprise. The scale of the Italian setback, some 300,000 casualties had been incurred, 90% of which were as prisoners. Virtually all artillery was lost. The defeat produced sizable shockwaves among the Allied governments. Until Caporetto, the Italians had been left to fight the Austro-Hungarian army alone on the Italian front. With the advent of German support and the disaster at Caporetto, however, this policy was revoked, with substantial Allied aid promised henceforth. 6 French army divisions were supplemented by 5 British divisions, both boosted by large air contingents. By the end of 1917, both sides were to some extent locked in a race against time. Britain was in danger of being starved into submission by the U-boats. But the American Expeditionary Force was now in France, scheduled to reach up to 3 million men in size. The Germans also realized that decisive action was needed before the Americans were ready to join the fight. 1918 would be a decisive year for both sides.